In the winter of 1651, inside the cold, echoing stone walls of Madrid's royal Alcazar, a newborn girl was placed into a cradle embroidered with the golden threads of the Spanish Habsburgs, the most powerful dynasty in Europe and the most cursed. Her name was Margarita Teresa of Spain, daughter of King Philip Roman IV. The court announced her birth with trumpets, processions, and proclamations of joy. But behind the velvet curtains, far from the public eye, a secret plan had already begun to form, one that would determine her entire future before she could even speak. Margarita was not just a princess. She was a dynastic solution, a bargaining chip, and the final hope of a family collapsing under the weight of its own bloodline. In the mid-17th century, Europe watched the Spanish Empire tremble. Once invincible, Spain now struggled with endless wars, economic decline, and a royal family trapped in a genetic maze. The powerful Habsburg monarchy, famous for ruling half of Europe, had one dark flaw: they married their own relatives so frequently that the dynasty's bloodline was collapsing. Generations of uncles marrying nieces, cousins marrying cousins, and kings marrying their own biological relatives had produced infertility, deformities, and a high rate of early deaths. And Margarita Teresa was born right into that world. From the moment she arrived, her fate was sealed by a single, terrifying expectation. She was groomed from birth to marry her own uncle. The plan was whispered in council rooms, concealed from the public, and discussed openly only by those who controlled the empire: Philip Roman IV, his ministers, and the ambassadors of the Holy Roman Empire. Europe needed the Habsburgs united, and the key to that unity was this little girl. As an infant, Margarita was described as beautiful, lively, and intelligent. Court observers wrote that she seemed to shine brighter than anyone else in the royal household. Painters like Diego Velázquez, the greatest artist of the Spanish Golden Age, immortalized her in huge portraits dressed in silver brocade, red ribbons, and towering hairstyles. To the world, she was a symbol of majesty. But to her family, she was a symbol of duty. From her earliest memories, Margarita lived a life of isolation disguised as luxury. She was raised in the deepest chambers of the Alcazar, surrounded not by playmates, but by ladies, in waiting instructed to shape every detail of her behavior. She was taught how to walk, how to stand, how to smile, even how to breathe gracefully. Every step was practiced, every word measured, every gesture rehearsed. She was raised not as a child, but as a future bride for a marriage she would never choose. By age 3, she was already the most painted child in Europe. Velázquez's portraits of her, glowing, stiff, royal, were not simple artworks. They were advertisements sent abroad to show the Holy Roman Emperor what his future wife looked like. Every brushstroke had political purpose. With each portrait, Vienna was reminded, asterisk asterisk, here is the bride you will one day receive. Asterisk asterisk, the emperor in question was Leopold I Margaret's uncle, her father's younger brother. He was nearly 2 decades older than her. This was not unusual for the era, but what horrified some diplomats was the degree of consanguinity. Leopold was not just her uncle. He was a close, blood Habsburg like the generations before him. The match was genetically dangerous, politically heavy, and absolutely necessary in the eyes of the dynasty. Spain could not survive without Austria. Austria needed Spain. The empire needed an heir with pure Habsburg blood, and Margarita was the only princess available who could supply it. As she grew older, she began to understand the strange way adults looked at her. She noticed how every lesson emphasized obedience, duty, and silence. She realized that her future was not hers. Her tutors spoke often of Vienna, preparing her mind for a home she had never seen. Her mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, who was herself Philip Roman IV's niece, warned her that loyalty to the dynasty was more important than personal happiness. Margarita slowly understood. Her life was already planned. Her destiny was not to rule Spain, but to be shipped across Europe as a sacrifice for political survival. Even her childhood play was monitored. Dolls were not simply toys. They were gifted in the style of Austrian court fashion, so she would grow accustomed to her future identity. She learned the German language before she learned how to read Spanish poetry. She practiced bowing the way Austrian archduchesses bowed. She was trained to greet her future husband with elegance, although she was only 6 years old. And each year her father, Philip Roman IV, moved closer to making the marriage official. But what makes Margarita's story so tragic is not simply that she was raised for an arranged marriage. Many royal children were. The tragedy lies in how completely her individuality was erased in the process. The Habsburgs did not see her as a girl with dreams, fears, or desires. They saw her as a vessel, a last attempt to save a dynasty collapsing under its own history. Yet even as she lived under suffocating expectations, Margarita remained bright, charming, and tender-hearted. Court reports describe her as kind, affectionate, and deeply loved by her servants. Her laughter, rare but beautiful, would echo down the stone corridors and remind everyone that despite her golden cage, she was still a child. But the court did not care about childhood. They cared about alliances, heirs, and power. By age 10, Margarita understood what awaited her. She wrote letters, carefully dictated, to Emperor Leopold, calling him my dearest uncle. While knowing the truth, one day she would be sent to him as his wife. In 1668, when she was just 15, the final decision was made. Preparations accelerated. Her dowry was calculated down to the last coin. Her trousseau was sewn by the finest hands in Spain. Her portraits were updated to show her as mature enough for marriage. The Spanish court celebrated her destiny, but Margarita Teresa did not celebrate. She grew quieter, paler, less joyful. The day the marriage contract was signed, witnesses recorded that she looked like a lily withering too soon. She would be sent across Europe soon. She would leave her homeland forever. Her marriage would bind two empires, but break her spirit, and the world would watch the terrifying fate of a princess raised not for love, not for choice, but for sacrifice. The winter of 1668 settled over Madrid like a veil of grey, and inside the royal Alcazar, preparations reached a fever pitch. At just 15 years old, Margarita Teresa stood at the center of the greatest political arrangement of her era. The Spanish Habsburg court, desperate for stability, had finalized her marriage contract with the Holy Roman Emperor, Leopold I, who was not only her uncle, but also the last hope of preserving the dynasty's power. The decision was celebrated as a triumph for Europe's two Habsburg branches, but for Margarita, it marked the beginning of the darkest chapter of her life. From the moment the treaty was signed, the palace transformed into a whirlwind of ceremony, calculation, and cold formality. Tailors, jewelers, scribes, ambassadors, and courtiers moved like shadows through endless halls. Carriages were polished, trunks were packed, and her dowry was counted again and again. Every item had to reflect the grandeur of Spain, even as the empire quietly weakened behind the scenes. Portraits, silver plates, ceremonial fans, religious icons, and entire wardrobes were prepared for her journey. But what the world did not see was the emotional devastation hidden beneath the glittering surface. Margarita Teresa was leaving not just a palace. She was leaving her childhood, her homeland, her language, her comfort, and everyone who had ever loved her. She had never stepped outside Spain, yet she was about to be escorted across thousands of kilometers, far from familiar faces, and into the cold, rigid world of the Austrian court. Even her clothes would change, as Vienna demanded a completely different fashion style, stricter etiquette, and a more suffocating discipline. During those final days in Spain, she spent long hours walking through the rooms of the Alcazar, pausing to touch the tapestries, the gilded doors, the carved wooden chairs. Servants observed her standing silently before the enormous mirrors, staring at her reflection with eyes that seemed older than her years. She understood too well that her future was not hers. It had been claimed long before she was born. Her last portrait in Spain was painted during this period. In it, her face appears solemn, thoughtful, almost resigned. The elaborate silver gown, the stiff corset, the ribbons, and the hairstyle all speak to her royal status. But her expression betrays something deeper. Historians studying the portrait today often comment that she looks like someone already carrying the weight of her own destiny. On April 20, 1666, after weeks of ceremonial farewells, she left Madrid in a massive procession. Cannons fired from the fortress, bells rang throughout the city, and people lined the streets to watch her depart. They cheered for their princess, their infanta, their symbol of hope. But Margarita did not wave enthusiastically. She simply gave a soft, graceful nod, as she had been trained, her face serene and her eyes filled with silent fear. The journey across Europe was long, exhausting, and emotionally brutal. Her caravan passed through Castil's dusty plains, crossed mountains, and traveled through regions plagued by political instability. At every city, grand receptions were arranged. Noble families greeted her, hosted feasts, and gifted precious items. But Margarita often felt detached from these scenes. As letters from her ladies in waiting reveal, she spent many evenings crying quietly in her carriage, whispering prayers for strength. The moment she crossed into the Holy Roman Empire's territory, the tone shifted drastically. Spanish traditions were stripped away. Her Spanish attendants were dismissed or lowered in rank. Her dresses were replaced with stiffer Austrian ones. Even the way she walked had to change. Vienna demanded perfection in every motion. She could not turn her head too quickly, smile too brightly, or speak too softly. She was being reshaped for her new husband. When her procession reached Vienna, thousands gathered to welcome her. Musicians played, cannons thundered, and the scent of flowers filled the air. But the imperial court was different from Spain. It was colder, more rigid, less forgiving. Every rule was absolute, every mistake punished by humiliation. The Spanish princess had to prove she belonged. The first meeting between Margarita Teresa and her uncle, husband, Emperor Leopold I, was recorded in detail. He approached her with a mixture of affection, admiration, and triumph. He had waited years to receive her. She was the bride he had been promised during her infancy. He kissed her hand, complimented her beauty, and declared that he would love her as both husband and protector. But while Leopold saw their union as destiny, Margarita saw it as captivity. Leopold was kind by political standards, but he was also deeply religious, intensely formal, and heavily shaped by the rigid expectations of the Habsburg family. He viewed marriage as duty above all else. He believed that Margarita was chosen by heaven to be his wife, and he expected her obedience in every aspect of life. Their wedding took place on ** December 12, 1666 **, in a grand ceremony that dazzled Europe. The church glowed with gold, musicians performed masterpieces, and the aristocracy witnessed what they considered the purest union of royal blood. But one detail stood out in the letters written afterward. Margarita looked frail, overwhelmed, and almost ghost-like during the vows. The marriage had begun, but the cost to her spirit was already visible. Life in the Viennese court soon became a nightmare. Margarita Teresa, raised in the warm, expressive environment of Spain, suddenly found herself trapped in an environment where every movement was judged. Austrian court customs were harsher, stricter, and colder. Women of the court whispered about her behind fans, mocking her accent, her clothing, and her youth. She was treated not as a queen, but as a foreign investment. Leopold adored her, but his affection could not shield her from the emotional toll of her new life. He was often occupied with wars, diplomacy, and religious duties. Margarita spent long days alone in the palace, surrounded by unfamiliar customs, and watched constantly by attendants who reported her every word. She longed for Spain. She longed for a family. She longed for freedom she would never have again. Her letters home reveal a heartbreaking truth. She often wrote about feeling weak, tired, and unwell. Court doctors dismissed her symptoms as nerves or delicate constitution. But modern historians believe she suffered from severe depression, chronic stress, and possibly early effects of genetic complications that plagued the Habsburg bloodline. Still, Vienna expected her to produce heirs. Her body became the battlefield of dynastic demands. At 16, she gave birth to her first daughter, Maria Antonia, but the pregnancy, birth, and postpartum period left her physically shattered. She never truly recovered, yet the pressure continued. The empire needed sons. Her health declined sharply, and her once bright personality dimmed. The girl who had lit the halls of Madrid with laughter now moved through the cold corridors of Vienna like a fading candle. In a court obsessed with appearance, no one seemed to notice the truth. Margarita Teresa was dying slowly, and the empire she had been forced to save was draining the life out of her with every passing year. By the early 1670s, Vienna's imperial palace had become both a shrine and a prison for the young Empress Margarita Teresa. At barely 20 years old, she was already fading. The lively Spanish princess, who once filled the halls of Madrid with brightness, now seemed like a shadow drifting through the cold corridors of the Hofburg. Her marriage to Emperor Leopold I had achieved its political purpose, strengthening the alliance between Spain and Austria. But for Margarita herself, the price had been unbearable. Her health deteriorated at a pace that startled even the imperial physicians. They attempted to reassure the court by calling her delicate, fragile, and overwhelmed by the demands of motherhood, but their private notes reveal far deeper worries. Margarita suffered from chronic fatigue, severe headaches, swelling, fainting spells, fevers, and stomach pain. She moved slower each month, as though every breath became a struggle. At court dinners, she often pushed food around her plate, unable to eat. Servants whispered that she was becoming too weak to rise from bed without assistance. Historians now understand the cruel reality behind her suffering. Margarita Teresa was a victim of centuries of inbreeding within the Habsburg dynasty. She carried one of the highest levels of genetic relatedness ever recorded in a European royal. Her father was her mother's uncle. Her husband was her father's brother. The bloodline had been compressed generation after generation until even the healthiest child was at risk. Margarita, despite her beauty and grace, had inherited a body struggling to function under the weight of biological burden. But in Vienna, there was no sympathy for weakness. Every moment of her life was watched, judged, and measured. The Austrian court was a place where etiquette mattered more than emotion, where royal dignity demanded silence instead of pain, and where a queen's tears could be considered a political embarrassment. Margarita was expected to walk with elegance, smile politely, attend ceremonies, and, above all else, produce children. Her body, however, was slowly collapsing. In letters to her family in Spain, she expressed her agony in subtle phrases. She could not openly complain because the Austrian court monitored her correspondence. Still, careful readers can sense her despair. She wrote of feeling constantly tired, of struggling to eat, of loneliness that felt like a heavy cloak. She longed for her mother, for the warmth of Spanish courtiers, for the familiar rhythms of her childhood. But more than anything, she longed to go home. Vienna, with its cold winters, strict rituals, and endless obligations, felt like a foreign world she could never truly belong to. Her Spanish attendants, once her source of comfort, were gradually replaced by Austrian ones, a move intended to integrate her more fully into her husband's world. Instead, it deepened her isolation. Meanwhile, Leopold, while genuinely fond of her, unintentionally contributed to her suffering. He was a dutiful emperor before he was a husband. Wars, diplomacy, and negotiations constantly pulled him away from her side. He believed that Margarita, as a Habsburg princess, understood the weight of duty. He did not recognize that she was breaking beneath it. Her pregnancies were the most devastating burden of all. Her first child, Maria Antonia, had survived, but later pregnancies resulted in devastating complications. One child was born prematurely and died shortly after birth. Another pregnancy nearly claimed Margarita's life. Each attempt to provide the empire with an heir weakened her body further. Doctors bled her repeatedly, believing it would relieve her symptoms. They purged her, dosed her with harsh medicines, and insisted she needed more prayer and less emotion. Their treatments, based on medical theories of the time, only made her worse. They failed to recognize that her illness was not caused by imbalance or melancholy, but by the heavy cost of dynastic expectations and genetic fragility. By 1671, courtiers observed that she was walking with difficulty, her steps hesitant, her breathing shallow. During formal events, she often had to sit for long periods, pale and trembling, pretending to be well. In private, she collapsed into bed as soon as her attendants closed the doors. She slept excessively, sometimes for entire days. The palace physicians noted her progressive swelling, hinting at organ failure, though they lacked the medical tools to understand it fully. Still, she was forced to attend state ceremonies. Still, she was forced to maintain the image of a divine empress. Still, she was expected to conceive another child. But Margarita Teresa's spirit had begun to separate from her body. There were moments when attendants found her staring silently out of the palace windows, watching the snow fall over Vienna's rooftops, as if searching for a world where she could breathe freely again. Other times, she whispered prayers to the Virgin Mary, asking for mercy, comfort, or escape. She missed Madrid's sun, the warmth of her native language, the gentle voices of the women who raised her. Yet even as she suffered, she remained obedient. That was the tragedy of her upbringing. From infancy, she had been trained to endure, trained to smile, trained to accept a fate she never chose. In 1672, her condition worsened dramatically. She experienced violent stomach pain, swelling in her legs, and repeated fainting fits. Some modern historians believe she suffered from severe intestinal disorders linked to genetic defects. Others think she encountered complications from chronic infections, untreated illnesses, or organ failure aggravated by repeated pregnancies. Whatever the exact cause, her body was giving up. At 20, she looked closer to 40. Her once round face had become thin, her cheeks sunken, her bright eyes had lost their sparkle. Even her famous golden hair, praised in countless portraits, had grown brittle and dull, but the court insisted she keep appearing in public. During a major imperial celebration that year, observers noted she could barely stand. Servants helped her walk, hidden behind her massive gown. Her breathing was audible, her skin pale as marble. Leopold held her hand, unaware that every step she took was agony. Shortly after this event, she collapsed in her chambers, vomiting and struggling to breathe. For several days, she drifted between consciousness and delirium, calling out for her childhood attendants, her mother, and her homeland. When she awoke, she begged her confessor to pray with her. She believed she was dying, and she was not wrong, but what shattered her heart was not death itself. It was the realization that even in her final months, the empire still viewed her as a tool. When she expressed a desire to return to Spain for healing, Leopold hesitated. His advisers refused outright. Allowing the empress to leave would look like weakness, they argued. It would signal political instability. So Margarita Teresa remained trapped in Vienna, a young woman in a foreign land, slowly slipping away, unseen and unheard beneath layers of royal protocol. Yet even as her strength faded, she never voiced rebellion. That was the ultimate tragedy of the Habsburg system. Its children were raised to serve the dynasty until their last breath, and Margarita gave everything she had, even as life drained from her body. Her final year would become the most heartbreaking chapter of all, the chapter in which Europe's most famous princess confronted her destiny, faced her collapsing body, and walked toward a fate she could neither outrun nor resist. By 1673, The Hofburg Palace had grown unnervingly silent around the young Empress Margarita Teresa. Servants moved more quietly, courtiers lowered their voices, even the footsteps in the corridors seemed softer, as though Vienna itself sensed that something sacred and fragile was slipping away. The Spanish princess, once celebrated as the shining jewel of Europe, had now become a pale figure confined to her rooms, living in a fragile space between duty and death. She was only 21. Her decline was no longer something the imperial doctors could hide behind polite phrases. They stopped calling her delicate. They stopped insisting that she simply needed more air, more prayer, or more rest. Their journals describe a woman whose organs were failing, whose energy had collapsed, and whose body could no longer withstand the expectations placed upon it. Repeated illnesses throughout her life had left her immune system weak. The pressures of the Austrian court had drained her. The pregnancies, miscarriages, and physical burdens of royal duty had pushed her far beyond what a young body could bear. And the deeper truth, the truth that no one dared speak aloud, was that she suffered from the irreversible consequences of the Habsburg bloodline. Her final year was marked by a quiet, heartbreaking routine. Late mornings, when she was strong enough to rise, she sat near the window wrapped in thick blankets, staring across Vienna's rooftops. The city continued with its bustling rhythms beyond the palace gates, completely unaware that the young woman inside was dying. Servants brought her warm broth, but she could rarely finish a bowl. She slept for hours at a time, waking only when the pain grew too sharp to endure. Every movement exhausted her. Every breath seemed forced. Every day felt like a negotiation between the fading flame of life and the weight of dynastic expectation. Yet even in her final weakness, she continued to show the obedience burned into her spirit since childhood. When Leopold entered her chambers, she tried to smile. When she was asked to attend a small ceremony, she tried to stand. Even when her legs trembled beneath her, she insisted on walking with dignity, the way she had been trained since infancy. In one letter to her mother, written months before her death, her handwriting was shaky, and the words were layered in sorrow. She spoke of her longing for Spain, the warmth of Madrid, and the comfort of people who understood her language and heart. She hinted gently, painfully, that she feared she would never see home again. Her mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, responded with the anguish of a woman who had lost her daughter long before death took her. But their letters were censored, monitored, and filtered through political lenses. Margarita and Mariana exchanged affection in carefully coded phrases, knowing Vienna watched their every word. Despite her failing condition, the imperial doctors continued their treatments remedies that, by modern understanding, only hastened her decline. They bled her repeatedly, weakening her further. They gave purgatives that left her dehydrated. They insisted that her fainting spells were caused by emotional melancholy rather than physical collapse. They believed that draining her would restore balance. Instead, it drained the last strength she had. Margarita's emotional isolation deepened too. Her Spanish attendants, once her source of comfort, had been replaced almost entirely by Austrian ones, leaving her surrounded by unfamiliar faces. They followed the rules, bowed, curtsied, and obeyed protocol, but none of them filled the aching void of companionship she craved. Even Leopold, despite his affection, was helpless. He loved his young bride. He admired her sweetness, her patience, her loyalty, but he was an emperor before he was a husband. Diplomacy, war, and governance consumed him. His understanding of medicine was limited, and his trust in his physicians was absolute. He did not realize the full magnitude of her suffering until her decline became undeniable. By early 1673, Margarita could no longer walk without assistance. The vibrant child, once immortalized by Velázquez, had become a frail woman barely able to stand. Her skin was paper, pale, her breathing was shallow, nights were the worst. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling from fever. Her attendants prayed beside her bed. She began refusing food. not out of stubbornness, but because her body could no longer process it. One night in late winter, she experienced a violent episode of vomiting and nearly lost consciousness. The palace erupted into controlled panic. Leopold was summoned. Priests were called to her bedside. Her confessor administered rites alternately meant for comfort and preparation. Servants lit candles in every corner of her chamber, weeping softly as they prayed. But Margarita, astonishingly, regained consciousness the next morning, and in that fragile moment she asked a single heartbreaking question: "Will I ever see Spain again?" The answer never came. In the spring of 1673, her condition reached its irreversible point. Her legs swelled dramatically. Her abdomen filled with fluid, a sign of severe organ failure. She experienced long stretches of delirium, calling out names from her childhood, whispering to people who were not there. Sometimes she addressed her mother. Other times she held out her hand as though reaching for a child she had lost. During her final days, the palace maintained a respectful silence around her. A thick stillness filled the halls outside her rooms. Courtiers waited. Doctors whispered. Priests prayed. Leopold visited daily, his face clouded by the realization that he was losing the woman he had hoped would be his lifelong companion. His grief was quiet but profound. He blamed fate, illness, and even himself, though he could not articulate why. On March 12, 1673, the end came gently. She lay in her bed, barely conscious, surrounded by soft candlelight. Her breathing was slow, uneven, like a candle flickering in a draught. Attendants held her hands. A priest whispered prayers of peace. Leopold knelt beside her, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. Margarita opened her eyes one final time. She looked toward the window, where the faint light of dawn was rising. Perhaps, in her final seconds, she imagined the warm glow of the Spanish sun she missed so deeply. Then, with a soft exhale, she slipped away. She died at 20. Europe mourned the empress who had been born for diplomacy, but died for duty. Her death was described in official documents as natural, sudden, tragic. But historians see the deeper truth. She was a victim of political ambition, a casualty of dynastic engineering, a life cut short by a dynasty that demanded everything and gave nothing in return. The consequences of her death were immense. The Spanish-Austrian Habsburg alliance weakened, the inheritance crisis in Spain deepened, and her daughter Maria Antonia became a fragile symbol of a dying bloodline. Without Margarita, the two great Habsburg branches drifted apart, leading to succession disputes that reshaped European power for decades. In the end, the princess raised from infancy to save an empire could not save herself. Her fate remains one of the most tragic reminders of the cost of royal duty, a story of a girl who was never allowed to choose her own life, her own love, or her own destiny.